Hello, everyone. Sam here, and we got to talk about Breaking the Dark, a Jessica Jones Marvel crime novel. This is a story that was released last year in March, I believe, and this was written by an author named Lisa Jewell. Uh, Jewell, I am not heavily familiar with her, but based on my research, Lisa Jewell is mostly known for writing psychological thrillers. Uh, and that's actually a decent fit for this character, as we'll soon discuss. Uh, Now, you heard me say the subtitle of a Jessica Jones Marvel crime novel. Uh, a lot of you Marvel fans probably already know who Jessica Jones is, but for those who don't, uh, Jessica Jones is in the Marvel universe, in the Marvel Comics comic book universe, and she's essentially this low-level superhero who has these basic powers, but she's not a terribly high-ranking superhero. And one day well, it's not one day, it's a traumatic event that happens over a long period of time. And by the time this trauma is done with, she decides to become a private investigator. Uh, she finds that sort of work much easier to do than the superheroics that have traumatized her. She was kind of this indie character who was made during the period when Marvel was doing some more explicit adult comics. I believe her comic was called Alias, and she was a very interesting character that came around in a time when Marvel was a little more experimental with their works, and she her powers, as I recall them, were not terribly flashy. She has like a certain amount of super strength and can fly. She can also heal at a slightly accelerated rate. Basic superhero powers. Uh, Most people are probably familiar with her from the Netflix TV show she had, simply titled Jessica Jones. That was on for a couple of years for 3 seasons, and that was back when Netflix had the Marvel shows on it that were a little grittier and edgier than stuff that was going on in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And they were meant to be part of the same cinematic universe. They were just kind of meant to be lower street level stories compared to, the world ending and galactic threats of the regular Marvel Cinematic Universe. Uh, and Jessica Jones had her 3 season show, starring Kristen Ritter, I believe, as Jessica Jones. And having watched that show, I'm of the opinion only the first season is really any good. The last two were kind of they were not nearly as interesting or well written, and that was kind of the opinion about most of the Netflix shows that they, aside from Daredevil, which everybody loved. Everything else on the Netflix Marvel's side was kind of either just passable or even outright bad. Uh, but that's where a lot of people know Jessica Jones from nowadays. And the point of Breaking the Dark is that it is meant to be part of a new series called the Marvel Crime series. It's kind of doing the same thing that Netflix did, where it's taking these characters who are a little more street level in the Marvel universe and telling their stories uh, in comparison to the bigger scale stories. The difference is that this is in literary form, not television form or a streaming form. And the whole point of Breaking the Dark is that it kind of takes the broad strokes of Jessica Jones's comic history And it follows that in a broad sense, but it is meant to be its own separate continuity from both the comics and the TV show, to give the author a little more freedom in telling the story they want to tell. Uh, and the main reason I read Breaking the Dark is because if you watched my Pandy Pack video from a few days ago, you'll know that I knew I was going to be getting this Marvel crime novel, Enemy of My Enemy, which has Daredevil as the main character. But Jessica Jones' story had come out first, and I was pretty sure they weren't going to be interconnected, but I decided I wanted to read Jessica Jones' story first before I did Daredevil's story first. So I read Breaking the Dark as I was waiting for this one to appear. Fortunately, my local library had this book on Hoopla, and I was able to get it as an ebook on Hoopla, so that was very fortunate. And yeah, that's the whole story of how I got Jessica Jones and sort of the broad history of Jessica Jones. Now, regarding the actual story for this book, the story starts off like most Jessica Jones stories do. She gets a new client for her private detective agency. And she's hired by a woman named Amber Randall, who is this wealthy New York City therapist. And she has two teenage twins who live with her for most of the year, but they go to Great Britain in the summer to be with their father, who Amber is divorced from for several years. But she noticed that after this last foray to Great Britain, the twins came back acting very strangely. You know, they show very little emotion other than saying everything is perfect. And their faces and bodies are perfect in the sense that there's no blemishes, there's no signs of like any like acne or any like mild disfigurement. They're perfect. They're like better than like most models you would see on a magazine cover, and this is very strange to Amber. Along with the fact that they're acting like a bunch of robots. So this story because of this story forces Jessica to not only investigate the twins in New York, but she also has to go across the pond to Great Britain. And she has to go to the small British town of Barton Wallop to learn what happened to the twins. And this being a private detective story, you know that she's going to discover some sinister things happening in this little town. And while this is going on, she's also having to navigate her relationship with Luke Cage, who is her on-again, off-again boyfriend in this iteration of the character. If you know the comics, you know that she was married to Luke Cage after a certain point. But in this, they're not married yet. They're still on an on-again, off-again relationship. And some of the story is her navigating that, along with this new case she's discovered. So I'll start with the things that I thought were effective in this story. This is going to sound strange the way I say it, but this story very much examines the concept of self-confidence. Because for those that don't know, one of the biggest problems of Jessica Jones, the primary personality flaw she has, is that she does not have much self-confidence. And a lot of that is due to the traumatic event she suffered. A lot of you know what I'm talking about, but for those who don't, basically a villain captured her and heavily abused her in a certain sense, that very much destroyed her mentally and for a while physically. And this story actually kind of looks at the idea of how Jessica's low self confidence really affects her. And it does this by paralleling uh, the mystery with the concept of social media. Because social media plays a very big part in this mystery. And I know saying that a lot of you probably going, ooh, mixing modern day things together kind of seems like a recipe for disaster. But I think the story does a good job of sort of having this interesting interplay between Jessica's low self confidence and social media, which is a big element of the villain's plan. I know that sounds kind of goofy, but again, this is based off comic books. There's a certain amount of goofiness to be had, but that sort of that interplay between self confidence and social media, while these fantastical elements are infused into the story, I actually thought was a pretty natural fit. Like it seemed like an idea Jessica Jones would examine, like taking a real life issue, but then kind of putting this like superhero and fantastical element to it so that you can sort of justify the superhero elements. And it works surprisingly well for me, like this idea of how social media affects self-confidence and how that could be a problem for someone like Jessica Jones who has crippling lack of self-confidence. I also kind of liked how with the social media thing, there's this idea throughout the story of how groomers kind of build cults. Like this idea of, because the main villain in this story, they want to make everybody perfect. They want to make everyone perfect, and then they essentially build a cult. That seems like a spoiler. It's not as big a spoiler as you'd think, but they basically want to make a cult, and they make this cult through social media. And the story kind of examines how we often talk about grooming in a sexual context, but this story points out that there's groomers in plenty of other contexts, and how you can build a cult that's not necessarily what's the word? Intrusive on like one's sexuality, but you can make one that's intrusive on one's mind and one's perception, which is the entire point of a cult. Cults often groom people sexually, but in this case they're grooming people mentally and just sort of playing on people's own feelings of self-worth. So that element was kind of interesting. It kind of reminded me of that TV show. Some of you might remember it. It was called The Following. I think it had Kevin Bacon in it, and the whole point of it was that like this serial killer had built a cult on the internet. It was a pretty goofy TV show, like not really believable in the general sense, but this story kind of goes with that same idea of someone building a cult through social media and kind of playing off the insecurity of people on social media and using that to build their cult. So that was an interesting concept. Probably the thing I like the most about this story is that it actually has a much more humane and likable portrayal of Jessica Jones. And because this was kind of my one big issue with the TV show, which was that I kind of thought that Jessica Jones in that version, Kristen Ritter did a good job playing her, but I always kind of felt she was a little too abrasive. Like I just never got the vibe from the few Jessica Jones comics I'd read And some of them were like the original Alias comics. I just never got the vibe that she would be as abrasive and, like sour and grumpy, like the way Kristen Ritter played her. She didn't do a bad job of that, but I just never really got the vibe. Oh yeah, this is how Jessica Jones would act. Like she seemed much more. I she didn't seem as mad and abrasive in the comics I read. She seemed much more like just beaten down. Just sort of like dragging herself day to day to do anything because she doesn't want the trauma of what she's experienced dragging her down. If she dwells too much on it, she's going to be a wreck. That was always the vibe I got in the comics I read. And this one sort of follows that lead, and they don't make her horribly abrasive. She's, you know, she wants to get things done. She wants to, keep things moving, but she definitely seems more empathetic of a character here. And I think that made this story much more enjoyable to go through, even though it goes to dark places. I think she's much more enjoyable as a character here than she was in that Netflix TV show and a couple of the other comic iterations I've seen a little bit of every now and then. But I really liked her in this book. That was a fun element I enjoyed. So that's the stuff I liked about the story. What was the stuff I didn't care for as much? Uh, Unfortunately, a lot of stuff I didn't care for was the actual mystery. Uh, because this story makes a decision that I kind of think is the kiss of death for any mystery story, which is you have the main story of what Jessica Jones is doing in her investigation, and then you have the villain's story going on second, and it's most of it is flashbacks showing how the circumstances that lead to the villain happen, and it's all in the past, and it's slowly building up to the present when Jessica Jones is experiencing it. And this is a tactic I've seen some mystery writers do in other books. I've seen in more modern ones than ones in the past. But this is always a choice that I don't think entirely works, because the problem with showing the villain's origin, their buildup of their plans, and how they got their power, kind of lessens the impact of the main character's discovery. Because this sort of takes the initiative out of Jessica's hands, because now we, the readers, are just seeing all the information that we need to figure out the mystery, and thus we're kind of with this situation where we know everything before Jessica does, and it doesn't make the story more engaging or more tense. It just kind of becomes, okay, we see this, and now we have to experience Jessica learning it herself, and we already kind of knew what was going on, and so it's like writing two stories at the same time, and but you just happen to have similar characters in the same events mushed into one. And this was something I've started reading, getting back into Sherlock Holmes again, and this reminded me of the very first Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet. Because there's this, if you've read the book, you know that there's the first half of the first, I would say, 2/3 of the novel is explaining how Holmes investigating how he figures out who the killer is, and right as the killer is caught, we then get like this very long multi-chapter flashback that shows the villain's motivation. And that was kind of a clunky thing. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle didn't really use that tactic much ever again probably because he realized, yeah, you didn't really need to tell that whole section explaining why the villain did it. Uh, you could just, have him explain it like in to Holmes after he's caught or whatnot. But at least there, there was sort of a reason for why it was going into it, because the killer in question was not associated with anybody in uh, London, because they were actually from a different country. And so it was kind of a thing where it felt like Doyle was trying to explain why this character was the way they were. And at the very least, in A Study of Scarlet, it was all in this one section. It wasn't spread out throughout the whole story like it is here in Breaking the Dark. So, yeah, that element of having the villain story go on with the hero story, that part didn't really work for me. Uh, I also think that the story setting bounces around a little too much, because the story starts in New York, where Jessica Jones starts her investigation. Then she has to go to Barton Wallop. Uh, but then after she's there for a third of the story, she immediately goes back to New York, and that's where the story is settled. And I thought the story kind of bounced around a little too much, because part of the appeal of the story is seeing Jessica Jones outside her usual environment. She's not in New York City anymore. She has to go to the exact opposite location, a small village in England. Something that a New Yorker like herself would probably feel a little out of place in. But we don't really spend that much time in that small town. And Jessica isn't even there in the finale. So the whole selling point of this book, like, oh, Jessica Jones in a environment she's not used to, that doesn't really play much into the story. She's there for maybe a third of the story, and that's probably being generous. And then she goes back to New York City, and it's just kind of like, it feels somewhat unnecessary. Like, if you had another writer, I could see another writer just typing in, going, yeah, we'll just make it New York City all the way. And the villain in this case, the British connection, the connection to the British was not necessarily needed. Like, this character didn't have to be British within the plot itself. This could have been an American villain all the same. It's like, yeah, the British element just kind of feels tacked on. Like, somebody really wanted Jessica Jones to be out of her main environment, but they didn't really commit to it. So that part kind of felt underdeveloped. I kind of wish there'd been more emphasis on Barton Wallop. Oh, this is one note I put in significantly. Story drags on way longer than needs to. And again, some of that ties into the Barton Wallop stuff, because when the second Jessica Jones comes back from Barton Wallop, after she knows, because there's like, she experiences this event that is clearly supernatural or fantastical, but the story keeps going for several chapters after that. And like, after that supernatural event happens and Jessica Jones goes on her merry way back to New York City, I'm kind of like, yeah, the story just does not have much going for it. Like, it just is overlong. Like, I think this was about 50 chapters, and not incredibly long chapters either, but a lot of them just kind of felt like they were really stretching things out. Like there's several chapters where it kind of feels like 2 or 3 chapters are told when it could have been done in one. Like the like I don't like using the word, but it really felt like padding. Like this was really padded out in order to get to a novel length work. Uh, so that was kind of a frustrating element. Uh, I guess the other problem is that a lot of the characters are not terribly memorable, uh, which is kind of a problem with Jessica Jones, because one of the appeals of Jessica Jones was seeing all the colorful characters and villains that she ran into just through doing this small PI work. And most of the characters are not memorable. The villains are not terribly memorable. Amber, the woman who hires Jessica, is not terribly memorable. I guess the sole exception would be the two teenagers who help out Jessica, Malcolm in New York and Elliot in Barton Wallop. Those two characters were kind of fun because they actually kind of forced Jessica to sort of like, all right, I think you're a bunch of annoying teenagers, but I gotta use your help to figure out what's going on. So those were probably the more interesting characters. But even then, them, I'm kind of like, they weren't like absurdly interesting. They were just sort of more cool for the dynamic they had with Jessica. Now this was on my note here. This was a big problem I had with with this story, is that the villain's plan. I won't spoil what the plan is, but the plan itself is a little bombastic for a Jessica Jones story. Uh, and what I mean by that is that, as I said earlier, Jessica Jones generally focused on more street level crime and the what like lower level villains did in New York City. And the problem is the villain's plan here is world affecting. It is not like one person looking for revenge or some drug lord trying to establish themselves in New York City. It is a world affecting plan. Uh, and that feels a little off for a Jessica Jones story, because I always thought that her stories worked better when they were on sort of the smaller level of the threat scale. And the villain, the problem is, I said the villain wasn't that interesting, but the villain is actually has this really bombastic and halfway goofy, halfway threatening plan, and she just this plan, this villain just do not really fit with a Jessica Jones type story. Like it's something that feels much more akin to like a one-off villain you'd see in like the Marvel team-ups, where Spider-Man and Howard the Duck had to team up to fight like some goofy I'm trying to remember, they were like fighting somebody who was like on the radio or something. I don't know. The villain here comes off as a little more akin to like a Silver Age comic book villain who just so happens to be in a 2020s Marvel story. Like, their plan is interesting, but it is very goofy and bombastic, and it's kind of like, and Lisa, I forgot her name, Lisa Jewell, the author of this story, she plays it pretty deadly serious, and it's kind of like, it's a person trying to make, I'm trying not to spoil the plan, but once you read it, you'll understand what I'm saying. Lisa Jewell's trying to make this very ridiculous plan like sound very grounded and serious, but it's kind of like, when you read it and you really think about it, you go, no, that's a pretty goofy thing. That's something you could see like the hypno hustler doing uh in the old Spider-Man comics when the hypno hustler showed up. But yeah, so the villain's plan doesn't really work for me. And it's so bombastic that it is literally fueled by dead children. Like it's so absurdly over the top that it's kind of like, how can you do this with a straight face? Like you're being powered by the tears of orphans and deceased children who died in farming accidents. That's a plot point. That's a plot point. I'm not making that part up. So yeah, that part doesn't really work for me, especially when it's presented with like zero self-awareness about how bombastic and goofy that sounds. Oh yeah, another thing I wrote down here is the climax is anticlimactic. Because the villain gets stopped easily. Like Jessica just runs up to them and slaps them, and that's the end of the villain's plan. And the way their plan is set up, you think, oh well, there's going to be some damage here because I mentioned a cult earlier. You're thinking, oh well, the cult element is going to come back in. It really doesn't. The second Jessica Jones slaps the villain, the plan is stopped quickly and it's easily undone. Like the damage that you think, oh, Jessica's going to have to fight to overcome. No, she doesn't. The problem just kind of stops and resolves itself. And it was kind of like, where was that was all. It was like you were doing an insane amount of buildup of this villain's plan, and then it just kind of ends. It stops, just with this little slap, and it's kind of like, what? Why all the buildup? Like, and again, I could see that sort of ending working if this was a smaller scale story, where like maybe somebody who's like a stalker or something Jessica runs up to and slaps him, and that's the end of the story. That could work because it shows how this insane person who's doing this really small act but is really disturbing to their victim, seeing that end in such a fast way, that would make sense. But when you build an internet cult devoted to making people perfect and it ends when you get slapped, that kind of feels a little underdone and anticlimactic. Well, I'm going in circles around the villain because I don't want to spoil what the villain is doing or the villain themselves. But the villain doesn't have much going for them because they are just this basic self-obsessed psycho, the one always smiling and and it's and the only motivation they have is to make themselves the center of attention, which as a villain motivation goes, that's fine and dandy, but again, small level. Making someone with that motivation on a small level, that would kind of make sense. But when you see the degrees they go to for the attention, you kind of go, okay, this doesn't quite work on the smaller level Jessica Jones is supposed to be. Now, to be fair, that is kind of the point. Like, the villain is using social media to become the center of attention. They are using it for that purpose, and that is part of the story's commentary. But again, you have this real facile motivation, and that could work if we knew a little more about this villain. But we really don't. We learn enough about them and their motivations, but they're not stupendous motivations. It's very basic level. And It's just one of those things where the villain is like a little too basic to work, in my opinion. They just don't have the sauce. Uh, and there was the last criticism I have written here is that there's this period through the first half of the book where Jessica has these run-ins with this mysterious little girl, and Jessica's trying to figure out what this means. She's worried, Jessica's mental state is always kind of frayed, and the alcohol she often takes doesn't help. So she's put on edge by the appearance of this mysterious little girl. But then there's a reveal halfway through about this little girl. And after that reveal's done, this little girl disappears. And you might think, oh, well, she disappeared because the reveal was done. She didn't need to be around anymore. But I'd argue that she kind of did need to be around, because this character has a very strong importance throughout the rest of the story. This little girl motivates Jessica to do something in the second half of the story that she probably wouldn't have done without this character appearing. And so having her just disappear out of the narrative the second the reveal's done, that felt a little off to me, because the whole point of the story was sort of showing Jessica sort of building up, like I said, the self-confidence. And that character is a big part of it, but I just wish that character had been more involved, because because she's just there until the reveal about her is done. It makes it just come off, oh, like this is just a plot device. This is not a character. This is a plot device to get Jessica to do this thing, and that kind of ruined that character for me, because it's kind of like, well, why aren't you doing more in the story? So yeah, that little girl character just didn't work for me, because it was very much trying to get to a point, or get Jessica to do something. And it kind of feels like Lisa Jewell wasn't really sure how to get Jessica Jones to that point, so she included this little girl character. And yeah, that element just did not work for me. So, a pox on it. So, final ranking. I had more negative things to say about this than I initially thought. I wrote my review for this about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. And my initial thing was, oh, no, this and this. But as I was going back over my notes and thinking about the story, I'm like, yeah, this story had more weaknesses than I thought. So I rank on a 5-star system, 0 out of 5 stars being the worst, 5 out of 5 being the best. I'm going to give this story 2 stars out of 5, which in my ranking is painfully average. More bad than good. To me, there's two kinds of averages: painfully average and pleasantly average. A pleasantly average one is one that you go, okay, this doesn't reinvent the wheel, but it succeeds at what it tries to do. And painfully average is, it's much more of a negative sensation. Like the averageness of the story feels like a mark against it. Like it's so aggressively average that you just don't feel much for it. And that's why I think this is a painfully average story, a 2 out of 5 star story. Because it's not poorly written. I think Lisa Jewell does do a good job with what she's given. And I do think it is, for the most part, engaging. At least for the first half. But the villain is lackluster. Their plan's kind of goofy. And the pacing gets really sluggish towards the second half of the story. And so all the things that I kind of liked about it sort of get killed by just that sluggish pacing and that lackluster villain. It's just like, yeah, this really feels like a story where Lisa Jewell is doing her best. And she is writing. She's writing to make this as interesting as she can. But either because, maybe Marvel wanted something longer, or they had some storyline they wanted her to do, this doesn't quite work. I don't really... Again, when it comes to books from major entertainment conglomerates, it can be a little hard to tell where something is the author's choice and where something is the corporation's choice. This book hasn't scared me off from Lisa Jewell. I might be interested to read what work she's done, because that might actually be interesting. I might find that work more engaging. But I just didn't find her work here, Jessica Jones, to be that interesting. If you're a Jessica Jones fan, you might be interested in this. Like I said, it kind of takes a broad strokes of Jessica's comic history and sort of does something different with it. So there might be some Jessica Jones fans who are interested in this, but I don't think I'd recommend it to anybody else. There's just not much here, and it's a whole lot of page count for a very thin story. So yeah, I just wouldn't recommend this to anybody unless you're a diehard Jessica Jones fan. So any inspiration? For those that don't know, I'm a working writer, and I like commenting when I read these stories and do these reviews, whether they've inspired me to write a certain kind of story, or if there's a story idea I'd like to look at. And I do like the one element in this story, the idea of a social media cult. Like I said, there have been works that have done it before, like The Following, but I've always kind of found it interesting, that idea of like this social media cult that controls people, because this has been something that a lot of people have worried about since social media really came to the forefront. Like this idea that social media will cause these groups to coalesce, and bad actors will control people through social media. And I'm not saying that we've reached the levels of The Following, but we have seen cases where people take the words of a social media personality maybe a little too seriously. So that's kind of an interesting idea I'd like to explore in a story. Though I will say mine would probably be more leaned with a technological bent than a magical one. That's a slight spoiler for this story. It's kind of a magical bent with this social media thing. Mine would probably be more technologically bent. So, yeah. All right. Well, that is all I have to say about this story. So that's where I'm going to end this. Probably later in May, I will probably do Enemy of My Enemy, because I'm a little more familiar with Daredevil than I am Jessica Jones. So this will be an interesting one to check out. So you can probably expect that sometime in May. But that's it for me for now. So I'll log off, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye.